Kash Patel arrived at 9:31, dressed in a charcoal suit, his posture measured, his composure practiced, the kind built after surviving multiple oversight committees in a short span of time. His legal team had prepared thoroughly. They had mapped every angle: wire transfers, classification authority, privilege logs. They had answers ready. But they had not prepared for the question that had not yet been asked. Thomas Massie arrived shortly after, dressed informally, intentional, deliberate. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to work. He opened his notes, avoided eye contact, and began with routine questions. Budget allocations, procedural details. Safe ground. Familiar rhythm. Patel answered smoothly. His attorneys relaxed slightly. That's how it begins. Because the most dangerous moments in a hearing are not when tension is obvious, it's when the room believes it understands the rules. When the first exchange feels predictable. When everyone settles into comfort. Massie then paused, set his pen down, and looked directly at Patel. Director Patel, in your September testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, you stated under oath that you had no specific knowledge of how many Epstein names were protected under executive privilege. Is that accurate? The question was precise, grounded, and unavoidable. Patel responded, yes, that was accurate. That answer now existed twice, on record and in that room. Massie then opened a red folder and placed a document on the table. No dramatic build-up. No explanation. Just evidence. The document, a December 19th FBI internal briefing delivered to Patel's office. Subject: classification status of Epstein-related files. Inside, 94 names marked under executive privilege. On the cover page, confirmation of receipt, with Patel's name, date, and initials. No interpretation needed. No speculation required. Massie slid the document into view and asked Patel to review it. Patel looked at the document, and said nothing. 4:34 seconds. In a congressional hearing, silence is not empty. Silence is recorded. Measured. Noted. The stenographer stopped typing, not because the session paused, but because no words were being spoken. Because the document didn't ask a question. It presented a contradiction. In September, Patel testified he had no specific knowledge. In December, his office acknowledged receiving a briefing listing 94 protected names. Those two realities now sat side by side. Massie didn't interrupt the silence. He let it stand. Because this wasn't about surprise, it was about building a record that could not be dismissed later. A confrontation can be argued. A document cannot. Three things happened simultaneously. Patel's legal team reacted, one attorney reaching for notes, another whispering, while Patel remained still, focused on the document he had already received months earlier. Massie continued calmly. The briefing had been obtained through a congressional subpoena, 41 days prior, reviewed, verified, and confirmed. By the time it reached the table, it was not new information. It was established fact. And under oath, the standard is not memory, it is truthfulness on material facts. How many names are protected under executive privilege is not a minor detail. In a case involving Epstein-related records, it is central to classification decisions. So the issue was no longer recall. It was consistency. And consistency under oath is not optional. The room felt it, not as noise, but as silence. No movement. No interruption. Everyone understood the shift. This was no longer routine oversight. This was a record being constructed. Massie closed the red folder halfway, signaling it wasn't finished. Because it wasn't. Inside were aligned dates, matching logs, and authorization trails pointing in one direction. And beside it, unseen until now, sat a second folder. Navy blue, thinner, verified by independent analysts before the session began. The red folder showed what Patel received. The blue folder would show what he said. And when receipt meets testimony, the question is no longer what happened, it becomes which version holds up. Massie continued without changing tone or pace. He moved forward through procedure, not theatrics. Director Patel, what is the standard FBI protocol for logging access to classified reclassification files? The question sounded routine. It wasn't. Because the answer determines whether actions followed standard protocol or deviated from it. And once deviations appear alongside documented records and sworn testimony, the comparison becomes unavoidable. At that point, the record speaks for itself. Patel responded carefully. He referenced internal procedures, oversight layers, and the established review channels that govern classification decisions. His explanation was consistent with protocol, on paper. Massie nodded once. Then he reached back into the red folder and produced a new document, an FBI access log. Time-stamped. System recorded. User tracked. One entry stood out. 11:47 p.m. Tuesday night. A reclassification process executed outside standard review hours. Massie placed the log beside the earlier briefing, aligning them within the same frame. Then he asked, "Director, is it standard FBI protocol for reclassification decisions of this magnitude to be processed at 11:47 p.m.? A simple question, but one with no easy path. If Patel said yes, it would suggest irregularity had been normalized. If he said no, the log would represent a deviation requiring explanation. Either way, the record would advance. Patel did not answer directly. He deferred, stating he would need to consult FBI counsel, citing classification constraints and operational sensitivities. Notice what happened. The log was not denied, the timestamp was not disputed, and the action itself was not challenged. The response shifted away from the fact and toward general procedure. That shift is significant. When a witness moves from a specific documented event to broad internal policy, it often signals that the document stands, but the explanation is not ready. Massie did not interrupt. He let the moment settle. Because this was not about immediate confrontation, it was about building a structured record. The access log remained on the table. The briefing remained beside it. Receipt. Action. Now the question became authorization. Massie then introduced another document from the red folder, a privilege log obtained through subpoena, covering approximately 2,300 pages of Epstein-related classification material. Within it were 47 entries marked under protection codes, each restricted. Critically, these entries were not accompanied by publicly documented statutory references. No visible legal basis was cited in the record provided. Massie did not summarize the gap. He read directly from the entries, line by line, code by code, then placed the privilege log beside the access log. Now the table contained multiple layers. The briefing, 94 names under executive privilege, the access log. Reclassification at 11:47 p.m. the privilege log. 47 protected entries without clear statutory citation. The structure was no longer abstract, it was cumulative. Massie asked, "Director Patel, can you identify the statutory basis for the protection codes applied to these 47 entries?" This was not a question of memory. It was a question of authority. Because classification power must be grounded in law. Patel shifted slightly, then responded with general references, ongoing law enforcement considerations, national security implications, executive privilege parameters. Familiar language. Broad, but non-specific. Again, the pattern remained unchanged. The documents were not denied. The protection codes were not challenged. The missing statutory reference was not addressed directly. Instead, the response circled the document rather than engaging its specifics. Massie continued calmly. He introduced another factor, scale. The reclassification review spanned approximately 2.7 terabytes of Epstein-related FBI material. Not a single file, but an entire body of investigative data. Scale matters because it affects oversight, accountability, and process. Then he returned to the timeline. December briefing 11:47 p.m. reclassification privilege designations recorded in logs. All separate elements, until placed together. Director Patel, who authorized the override that bypassed the standard classification review board for this reclassification process. This question completed the chain: access, timing, protection, and now authorization. Patel did not name a specific individual. He again referred to layered review processes and internal protocols, avoiding direct attribution. The absence was noticeable. Not in what was said, but in what was not. No denial of the documents. No correction of the logs. No clear identification of authority. Massie allowed a brief pause to register that silence. Because in structured records, absence is not empty, it is measurable. At this point, the hearing had effectively shifted. Not by declaration, but by structure. Documented evidence. Prior sworn testimony. And inconsistencies that had not been reconciled. Patel was not disputing the documents, but he was not aligning them either. That creates pressure, not rhetorical pressure, but evidentiary pressure. Massie then moved forward, because the sequence was not complete. The red folder had revealed what Patel received. The blue folder would now address what Patel had said. He opened the navy blue folder and turned to a flagged page. Director Patel, in your testimony before the House Oversight Committee in November of last year, you were asked whether any active Epstein-related investigations had been terminated in the preceding 12 months. He paused, then read the answer exactly from the transcript. No active investigations had been terminated in that period. That statement now existed in the record twice, once in November, and again in this hearing. Massie placed the transcript on the table, then retrieved documents from the red folder. What followed were FBI case closure logs, obtained through subpoena, each timestamped and authenticated. They listed 23 investigations, all closed within the preceding 12 months, many tied to Epstein-related classification material. He placed those logs beside the November transcript. Now the comparison was direct. On one side, sworn testimony stating no active investigations had been terminated. On the other, documented closure logs showing multiple investigations closed within that time frame. At that point, the hearing structure reached its most critical phase, where testimony and records occupy the same space. Massie looked at Patel. Not at the notes. Not at the documents. At the record. And the record, now fully assembled, had become a direct comparison between what was said under oath and what the documents show occurred. At Patel, both of those statements were made under oath. He did not raise his voice. He did not emphasize a single word. One of them cannot be true. That is not an accusation. It is a condition. Because the law does not require interpretation here, it requires consistency. Two sworn statements that cannot coexist create a conflict that no procedural language can resolve. Watch what happens next. Patel's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of November. Not dramatically, just enough to register. And that detail matters. Because reactions to documents often reveal more than the documents themselves. A date in a hearing like this is not just a reference, it is a trigger. November represents testimony under oath, recorded, fixed, and now brought forward alongside evidence that appears to contradict it. The room recognized that immediately. Two reporters in the gallery stopped writing. Not because there was nothing to document, but because the moment required attention, not transcription. Patel's legal team reacted quietly. A brief whisper. A shift in posture. But neither attorney stood. Neither objected. There was no procedural violation to challenge. The documents were authenticated. The transcript was accurate. So the comparison stood unchallenged. And Patel was left alone with it. He responded in a measured, controlled manner. He referenced ongoing investigations, classification constraints, and executive privilege. He declined to confirm or deny specific documents in an open setting. A familiar structure, but incomplete. Because he did not deny the closure logs. He did not dispute the timeline. He did not challenge the documented entries. And crucially, he did not reconcile his November statement with the records now presented. That absence is significant. Reconciliation would require selecting one version of events over the other, and accepting the implications of that choice. Massie did not force that decision. He didn't need to. He allowed the contradiction to remain visible. Because in a structured record, unresolved contradictions carry more weight than those argued away. Patel then offered a deferral. He suggested a classified briefing, where additional details could be discussed in a secure setting. But that is not an answer. It is a shift away from the public record. Massie responded immediately. He accepted the acknowledgement, but kept the matter in the open. No delay, no private session, no off-camera resolution. Because once an issue is established publicly, moving it behind closed doors does not resolve it, it only postpones it. The room fell into a different kind of silence. Not confusion. Recognition. Everyone understood the same thing at the same time. This was no longer about isolated answers. It was about a pattern. 23 investigations closed. 47 entries protected. 94 names listed. A reclassification processed at 11:47 p.m. And at the center, a sworn statement that does not align with the documented record. Massie did not repeat the numbers. He did not restate the contradiction. He let the pattern stand. Then he moved to consolidation. One by one, he entered the documents into the congressional record. The case closure logs, the November transcript, the access log with the 11:47 p.m. timestamp. Each document formalized. Each one preserved. Because once entered into the congressional record, they become permanent. Not edited, not summarized, not altered for presentation. They remain exactly as submitted. At that point, the hearing crossed a threshold, not in tone, but in consequence. Legal standards begin to emerge from the structure of the record itself. Perjury requires a knowingly false statement under oath, supported by documented contradiction. Obstruction involves interference with an official proceeding. Massie did not state these conclusions aloud, but he placed the elements that define them into the record. Sworn testimony, conflicting documents, and a verified timeline. Then he stopped. No accusation. No final judgment. Because at this stage, the record does not need interpretation. It only needs to be read. And once it is read, the question forms itself. What happens when the record no longer requires explanation, only acknowledgement? At this point, nothing in the room is hypothetical. Not the dates, not the documents, not the sworn statements. Everything is fixed. Massie closed the red folder, calmly, without emphasis. A subtle motion, but meaningful. The construction phase was complete. What remained was consequence. Because once documents are entered, contradictions are visible, and testimony remains unresolved, the hearing is no longer about discovery. It becomes about accountability. And accountability does not unfold in the moment, it unfolds afterward. Massie stepped slightly back from the microphone, creating distance. Not disengagement, but transition. Because the next phase is not about questions. It is about what the record does once it leaves the room. Consider the chain that now exists. The House Oversight Committee holds the documents. The Senate record contains prior sworn testimony. The congressional record preserves everything permanently. And oversight authorities now have a complete, traceable body of evidence. That is chain of custody in this context. Not just who handled the documents, but how the record moves forward. Because in the end, the record does not stay in the room. It travels. Massie had already taken the next step before leaving the building. A formal referral was submitted to the DOJ Inspector General, citing the closure logs, the privilege log inconsistencies, and the November testimony. Not as a conclusion, but as the basis for independent review. Because in systems like this, the most powerful move is not to declare guilt, it is to create a record that demands investigation. And that is exactly what had been built. Now step back from the room. Because this is where the broader dimension becomes unavoidable. 23 investigations. Each representing a separate line of inquiry, each tied to potential individuals whose identities remain protected. 47 entries shielded without clearly stated statutory authorization in the public record. 94 names listed in a briefing delivered directly to the office that later testified it had no specific knowledge of them. And 2.7 terabytes of classified material. That is not just data. That is a historical footprint of decisions. What was examined, what was protected, and what was ultimately closed. So the question becomes unavoidable. When investigations close, when names remain sealed, when decisions are made outside standard review hours, Who is the system ultimately protecting? This is not about individuals. It is not about party lines. It is about whether the mechanisms designed to uncover truth can be influenced in ways that contain it instead. That is the real question that sat beneath everything in that room. Massie never needed to say it out loud. The documents said it. The timeline said it. The contradictions said it. And he left knowing something very clear: the hearing was not the end, it was a transfer point. Because what follows does not happen in front of cameras. It happens in offices, in internal reviews, in determinations that rarely make headlines but shape outcomes that cannot be reversed. Most people will only see the summary, the early exchanges, the procedural questions, the surface-level narrative. But the core of what happened, the point where the record began to conflict with itself, lies deeper. Not hidden, just not emphasized. And that difference matters. Information does not need to be erased to be overlooked. It only needs to be condensed into a version that loses its structure. What was built in that room was not a talking point. It was a documented sequence, statements under oath, verified records, and contradictions that now exist in permanent form. The 47 protected entries remain sealed. The access logs remain recorded. The authorization trail tied to the 11:47 p.m. reclassification remains part of the documented chain. And the connection between testimony and documentation is now part of the official record. Once recorded, it does not disappear when the cameras turn off. Kash Patel left the chamber without speaking to the press. His legal team followed in silence. No immediate clarifications, no statements, no attempts to resolve the contradiction on the spot. Because there is no immediate resolution to something of this nature. There is only process. And process moves slower than public attention, but carries lasting weight. So the question remains: if two sworn statements cannot both be true, and if the documents supporting that contradiction are authenticated, entered, and preserved, what happens next? What does accountability look like when evidence is not disputed, only unresolved? And what does it say about a system if that question is never clearly answered? Because that is the real test, not of one individual, but of the structure itself. Whether it can correct course when the record demands it, or whether it absorbs contradictions and continues unchanged. That is not a partisan issue. It is a public one. And now that the record exists, it belongs to anyone willing to examine it.